Before you were born, someone already knew if you would be saved or damned. At least, that's what millions of people have believed for thousands of years. And for some, that belief brought comfort. For others, it sparked a crisis that would tear families, nations, and souls apart. This is the story of fate, not the kind in fantasy novels or fortune cookies. The kind that shaped empires, justified slavery, and convinced mothers that their children's suffering was written in the stars before they drew their first breath. In the 4th century before Christ, a philosopher stood in the marketplace of Athens and made a declaration that would echo for millennia. His name was Zeno of Citium, and he taught that everything that happens was meant to happen. The universe, he said, operates like a perfectly wound clock. Every gear turns exactly as it must. Your joys, your tragedies, your choice, all of them, were set in motion long before you existed. This wasn't just abstract thinking. It was a philosophy called Stoicism, and it offered something precious to people living in unpredictable times. If your child died of fever, if invaders burned your home, if you lost everything you loved, Stoicism said this was always going to happen. The universe had written your story, and your job was simply to accept it with dignity. For Roman slaves and emperors alike, this brought a strange peace. Marcus Aurelius, one of Rome's greatest rulers, wrote in his private journals that he was merely playing a role assigned to him by fate. Even his power, his decisions, his legacy, none of it was truly his. He was an actor reading lines written by the cosmos itself. But halfway across the world, another tradition was teaching something similar, yet profoundly different. In the courts of ancient India, priests spoke of karma, the idea that your present life was determined by actions in a previous existence. You weren't born into poverty or privilege by accident, you earned it. Every joy and every suffering was a consequence of choices made by a version of you that you couldn't even remember. A child born into the lowest caste, forbidden from touching certain objects or entering certain spaces, wasn't the victim of injustice. They were paying a debt from another lifetime. This belief became so deeply woven into Indian society that it would take millennia to begin unraveling. Then came the Abrahamic faiths, and with them, a question that would split Christianity itself in two. If God knows everything that will happen, if he knew before creating the universe who would accept him and who would reject him, did he also decide it? And if he decided it, how could anyone be held responsible for their own damnation? In the 16th century, a French theologian named John Calvin gave an answer that millions found both liberating and horrifying. Yes, he said, God chose who would be saved and who would be condemned before the foundation of the world. Your eternal fate was sealed before you were born, before you could sin or repent, before you could even choose. Calvin called it double predestination. God actively selects some for heaven and others for hell, and nothing you do can change it. For his followers, this was glorious news. If you felt faith stirring in your heart, it meant God had chosen you. Your salvation was guaranteed. You could stop living in fear of losing it. But there was a darker side. What if you didn't feel that faith? What if you doubted? What if you looked at your life and saw only struggle and emptiness? Did that mean God had marked you for destruction before you were born? Parents began watching their children for signs of election or reprobation. Communities formed hierarchies based on who seemed blessed and who seemed cursed. In colonial America, Puritan preachers told congregations that God might have created some of them specifically to display his wrath, like pottery made only to be smashed. And the people in those pews sat, wondering if they were the ones destined for the fire. Islam too wrestled with this question. The Quran speaks of divine decree, of God's knowledge encompassing all things, of fates written on a preserved tablet. Some scholars taught that God knows what you will choose, but doesn't force the choice. Others argued that even the illusion of choice is part of the divine script. A person who commits evil does so because God willed them to commit it, and yet they are still accountable for the sin. In 8th century Baghdad, a sect called the Qadariyah dared to suggest that humans might have real free will, that our choices weren't preordained. The caliph branded them heretics. Some were executed. The debate raged for centuries, and in many corners of the Islamic world, it still does. But here's where the story takes a turn that no one expected. In the 19th and 20th centuries, scientists began examining the brain, and what they found was unsettling. Every thought you have, every decision you make, happens because of electrical impulses and chemical reactions in your neurons. Those reactions follow the laws of physics. They're caused by prior states of your brain, which were caused by states before that, stretching back to your birth and beyond. Some neuroscientists now argue that free will is an illusion, not because of God or karma or cosmic destiny, but because of biology and physics. Your sense of making a choice happens after your brain has already begun the process of making it. By the time you're aware of deciding, the decision is already in motion. This is where ancient philosophy and cutting-edge science meet in an uncomfortable place. The Stoics said you're following a script written by the universe. Neuroscience says you're following a script written by the laws of nature. Either way, the script exists. So what do we do with this? If our fates are written, does morality collapse? If a murderer couldn't have chosen differently, is he still guilty? If a saint couldn't have chosen differently, does she deserve praise? Across history, believers in fate have answered these questions differently. Some said yes, it undermines responsibility. The Gnostics, an early Christian sect, taught that the material world itself was a prison created by an evil god, and our fates within it were predetermined suffering. They were declared heretics and hunted. Others said fate and responsibility can coexist. The Stoics believed that even though your life was determined, you still had a duty to act with virtue. Calvinists believed that even though God chose who would be saved, humans were still commanded to repent and believe. The contradiction was a mystery, something human minds couldn't fully grasp. But for ordinary people, the question wasn't academic. In India, belief in karma was used to justify brutal caste oppression for centuries. In colonial America, predestination was used to justify slavery. The enslaved were suffering because God had decreed it, perhaps as punishment for sins in a past life, or as part of his inscrutable plan. In medieval Europe, the poor were told their poverty was God's will, and to resist it was to resist him. Fate, it turns out, is a dangerous idea in the hands of the powerful. Yet for others, it was a source of profound strength. Enslaved Africans in the Americas blended Christian predestination with African spiritual traditions, creating a faith that said their suffering was temporary, but their deliverance was written in eternity. They sang spirituals about a freedom they believed was promised by forces beyond human cruelty. And eventually that belief helped fuel movements that broke their chains. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, wrote that even in the most deterministic circumstances, where every aspect of your life is controlled by others, you retain one freedom: the freedom to choose your attitude toward your suffering. He didn't know if that choice was real or predetermined, but he knew that believing in it saved lives, including his own. And maybe that's the final twist. Maybe the question of whether fate is real matters less than the question of whether we should live as if it's real. Every major religion and philosophy that has embraced predestination has also insisted that humans must act as if their choices matter. The Stoics said accept fate, but live virtuously. Calvinists said trust in God's sovereignty, but evangelize urgently. Hindus said karma determines your station, but dharma demands you fulfill your duty. It's as if humanity has always known something that science and theology struggle to articulate, that we need to believe in both destiny and agency, even if logic says we can't have both. Today, polls suggest that belief in fate, destiny, or predestination remains widespread, not just in religious communities, but in secular ones too. People say things like everything happens for a reason, or it was meant to be. We look for patterns in chaos, meaning in randomness, purpose in suffering. Perhaps because the alternative, that our lives are a series of accidents in an indifferent universe, is too bleak to bear. Or perhaps because somewhere deep in the human psyche, beneath culture and creed and philosophy, we sense something true. Maybe not fate in the way the ancients imagined it, not a cosmic ledger or a divine decree, but something older and stranger. The knowledge that we are part of a vast interconnected web of cause and effect, stretching back to the beginning of time, that every choice we make was shaped by choices made by others before us, that we are both free and bound, authors and characters, creating our stories with materials we didn't choose. The question isn't whether your fate was written before you were born. The question is what you'll do now that you're here, holding the pen, unsure if the ink is already dry.